It's much appreciated. I have to thank our volunteers who've been helping us today and in the last week, and we much appreciate their help. Obviously, I want to thank all the speakers who've come here today to speak. We really appreciate that. And I want to personally thank the other board members of Belta for their hard work in making this happen. It's an absolute joy to work with them. I couldn't ask for anyone better. So, to Jürgen, to Vicky, to Mika, Ellen, and Krishna, thank you, because this is it's been a great project for us to work on, and we look forward to doing more of these things in the future. But I have to say this now as my public service announcement, that the Belta board is small, there's not many of us, and it's a big job. So if you're interested in what we're doing and you want to help us with anything, let us know, because we need people to get involved and come on board. And it can be from small to large. Small and local, that's fine. We want to start doing workshops, local workshops, so if you're interested, let us know, and you can host a workshop for us. Or if you're interested in becoming a board member, there are jobs that need doing. So if you want to, if it looks like something that you would find enjoyable, and trust me, it really is enjoyable. It's really enjoyable. Then it's work, but it's really good work. Trust me. Then let us know, and we can speak to you about that. Okay. And then just a quick reminder, on the 15th of June, we're having another session. So if you're a business English teacher, we're having an event for business English teachers in Leuven. And it's in coordination with IATEFL's Business English Special Interest Group. We'll be screening a live conference, and then you'll have the space, the opportunity to share your reactions to the talks that you've seen with other business English teachers. So I think that would be really, really interesting if that's your area. Okay, I have to talk about the internet. Over there are 2 usernames and passwords. So if you want to connect to the internet, and if you're one of those social media people like I am, then feel free to go online and tell everyone that you're here and that you're having a great time and nice things. Go online and take photos and share them, and we're very happy for you to do that. So that's how you get online to do that. What else do you want to say, Mika? Is that everything? Okay. So I'm now going to introduce Philip. I just have to get my little prepared notes here, which are on my phone. I'm not doing Facebook now. Okay, so we're proud to introduce our plenary speaker today, Philip Kerr. Philip has worked as a teacher trainer, lecturer, educational manager, and writer of educational materials. So he's got the lot. He's done it all. He has lived and worked in the UK, Morocco, Spain and Belgium, and he has presented at conferences and run teacher training courses in more than 25 countries, although not many things in Belgium before, Philip. There you go. So he's a very prestigious and well-known speaker. Thankfully for us, he lives in Brussels, which is very convenient of him, and we're very, very grateful to him for that. You may know his publications, including the coursebook series Straightforward and Inside Out, both with Macmillan. And he's also just published an ebook entitled How to Write Vocabulary Presentations and Practice, a training course for ELT writers, for the ELT Teacher to Writer series. Today he's going to talk about translations, a subject that can provoke strong reactions. And I'm sure you agree with me that it's a subject in serious need of reappraising. I can't wait to hear what Philip has to say on this subject. So please join me in welcoming Philip.
Thank you, James. Thank you all very much for coming. As James said, I lecture all over the world, never in Belgium. The last event that I went to in Belgium as a speaker was a book fair in Tournai, and this was about 9 years ago, which was very poorly attended. I know that the British Council from time to time organised things. The British Council seems to have... You want to come to the British Council?
Kerr.
Yes. The British Council is sort of doing a disappearing act in many places. When I first lived in Belgium, 25 years ago, there was a superb British Council Resources Centre in Really. And I would go in there on a regular basis, reading and photocopying and all the rest of it, and since then things have changed, but anyway, not much has happened in Belgium, but historically there were things, and those of you who are as old as me, you'd have to be at least my age, might remember the last international IATEFL conference in Newport in the early 80s, a long, long time ago. It was one of the very last international IATEFL conferences. Maybe it was because of that they decided to keep it in the UK. Anyway, look, I'm talking about translation, and I would normally begin a talk by thanking my publishers for sponsoring me, but no one's sponsoring me today at all. I live just down the road, and it's quite nice not to have to represent somebody from time to time. Translation is a thing I'm working on a lot. I'll explain more. Let's just get the thing up here. And the first thing I want to tell you is that there's no real need to take notes if you were so keen that you wanted to take notes. There is a handout, it's a digital handout in the form of a blog, and the address is translationhandout.wordpress.com. It's not a blog which I post on regularly. I'm not updating it, or very rarely updating it, so there's no point particularly following me. It's not that kind of blog, it's a handout, but all of the links that I'll be using, most of the suggestions are on this digital handout, along with the bibliography, which is long and full. So if anyone is doing an MA, for example, in applied linguistics, you might be interested in this kind of thing. There's not much really published on the subject. You have to wait. I've just finished a book in translation on own language activities from Cambridge University Press, and that will be published early next year, probably February or March of next year, which is a practically oriented book. In the meantime, there's a little booklet which I wrote with my friend and colleague Lindsay Clanfield called A Guide to Dictation and Translation, which is downloadable free at the macmillanstraightforward.com site. So it's got a few ideas, but it's a little booklet, that's all. Okay? That's the background information. When I talk about translation to people, a lot of people do react with a degree of shock or even horror. How could you possibly want to bring back translation? How could you recommend translation? And I can understand that, and I can understand it particularly strongly in my role here as a parent. I have a 16-year-old daughter, one daughter who's 16 years old, who's in a, well, I won't mention the name of the lycée, but she's in a lycée in Ixelles, here in Brussels, and her experience of learning English, because French is her mother tongue. Her experience of learning English is horrific. The first year of study, because of course they don't start until, what is it, fourth year? The experience was shocking. The teacher said at the very beginning of the year, handing out photocopies of dirty English grammar in use, that what we will be doing this year, this is all in French, what we will be doing this year is studying the grammar. And next year we'll start doing some speaking and things. Her elder sister, who's now 21, was at the same school, and her elder sister is bilingual. The teacher didn't realise that my daughter was bilingual, and therefore that her English was better than the teacher's until the end of the year. So here we've got some examples of some really, really awful approaches to teaching, which were based entirely on translation. And this has been called by some people the who will take the next, the first sentence approach, where we've got a text. If anyone is British in here and studied French at school, you might have used a book called Whitmarsh, which was the kind of the standard book of the 60s. And the Whitmarsh meant that you read a text, an extract from, it could be Camus, it could be Sartre, or it could be Mauriac or somebody like that, and you'd read it aloud, and then the teacher would say, right, who's going to take the first sentence to translate? And the students would look at the desk very busily, and the teacher said, right, you, begin. Picking on people. This is not at all what I'm recommending. I'm not even talking about translating literature. It's of very little relevance to most students learning English around the world. We don't, after all, learn English to appreciate the finer points of Jane Austen. We typically are learning English in order to use it transactionally in a working world. And in any case, and I see this with my 16-year-old at school who's having to read Edgar Allan Poe, in order to appreciate Edgar Allan Poe, you would need at least a C2 level of English, and not the B1 level, which is typical of school leaving here in Belgium. Now, it may be better in the Flemish part of the country. My knowledge is of the French-speaking part of this country, where the average level at the end is B1, if you're lucky. Well, you can't get near Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm not talking about this kind of thing at all, away from all of this. The interest in translation has been growing for a number of years, and it was really given a kickstart in 2010 when a very well-known and respected applied linguist, Guy Cook, published a book called Translation in Language Teaching. This book won quite a number of prizes, which made it very influential, and it's also now pushed a number of other people to do other work. It certainly is the book which is primarily responsible for me wanting to write the book that I'm going to be publishing with Cambridge next year. The book is essentially a book of theory, explanations of why we should consider using the student's own language in the classroom. There is a little bit of practice in there, but really very little, just a little bit at the end, one chapter. So what I've become interested in is trying to write a companion volume, if you like, which is essentially a recipe book full of practical ideas. And I want to keep my theoretical discussion very brief and move as quickly as I can on to practical suggestions. What could you do in a classroom making use of the student's own language, whether it's Flemish or French or whatever it may be. And this may, of course, mean that the class is multilingual. The typical high school class here in Brussels is not only French-speaking as a mother tongue. It's French and Turkish and Arabic and many, many others. So I'm interested too in activities which don't require the teacher necessarily to know the student's language. So Cook said that translation should be a major aim and means of language learning, and it's a major break with tradition. But he's actually wrong here. This is disingenuous. He's trying to sort of blow his own trumpet. It's not a major break with tradition at all. Every single significant applied linguist for the last 30 years, name anyone, has supported the use of the student's own language. It's quite interesting that we have an orthodoxy where the use of the student's own language is effectively banned. When I first started lecturing on the subject, I would ask participants in conferences if they ever used translation in class, and one or two hands might go up, tentatively. What became very clear was that almost everyone in the room used translation at one point or another, but they didn't dare admit it. This has been partly to do with the influence of the Brits and the world of ELT, the ELT discourse, which is dominated by native speakers like myself, whose background essentially has been working in multilingual classes in universities or language schools, where we can't do much with the student's own language. But it's shifting. Every single applied linguist that I've ever come across has said at some point on record, yes, there is a role for the student's own language. I'll come back to it and say a little bit more. It does kind of beg the question, well, if we're bringing translation back, did it ever really go away? No, it didn't. We know that in universities, translation is the norm in most countries in the world. In some countries like Germany, it's a very fundamental part of learning a foreign language. In Belgium, it seems to me to depend very much on the particular university, the approach that they take, but translation is still very much there in the universities and always has been. And I'm not just talking about those students who are studying English philology or literature, whatever it may be, even those who are studying English as part of, say, a media and communications course, like my daughter at university here, or an engineering course, will be doing some translation at some point. So it's always been there, it's never gone away. This is also true of the high schools, both secondary and the primary, and certainly in Belgium, in my experience. In my children's primary school, which was a fairly good primary school, I thought, in Evere, the teachers used the students' own language, French, because they couldn't actually speak Flemish. One of the horrors of this place is that in primary teaching, a lot of Flemish is not being taught because the teachers can't do it. Nothing happened. But in secondary schools too, the student's own language is used all the time. All the time. So it's never really gone away, and more to the point, it couldn't really ever go away anyway. One of the things as a teacher trainer, I worked on the Belta and Delta courses quite often. One of the things as a teacher trainer that you say to your trainees is, but you've got to get your students thinking in English. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that we say. Well, That's a nice ideal, but it's only an ideal and it's not very close to reality. In order to think in another language, we need to know what we mean by thinking. It's a complex cognitive term, thinking in another language. Cognitive scientists don't actually agree at all what it means, thinking in another language. But such evidence as there is would suggest that if you are to begin to think in another language, that means that you're speaking that language automatically without having to translate. You would need to have a minimum of B2, i.e. C1 or C2 or above. You could not possibly think in a foreign language if you're a typical high school student who's struggling to get anywhere near B1. So you're not going to be thinking in the target language English anyway. Whatever we might like to think ideally, you're going to be thinking primarily in your own language and you will be translating. If your students are going to be doing that, it's silly to pretend that they're not. It's just ridiculous. Tell me it in English. If they don't say it in English, probably they can't say it in English, and maybe the best way to find out what they want to say is to get them to say it in their own language, and then we work through translation to express that. So looking at bringing the own language back into the classroom is an attempt to be principled in our approach, rather than living in cloud cuckoo land, which is what it's been. I'll say more. So it's not gone away. It never did. A very brief theoretical overview of the reasons for bringing language back. First of all, the student's own language is necessarily a point of reference in learning another language. All learning of any kind, whether it's languages or IT or whatever, is scaffolded on previous learning. You don't just learn in a vacuum. Well, our learners, when they start learning a language, bring enormous amounts of linguistic knowledge to the classroom, and that linguistic knowledge is their own language. They cannot avoid making those comparisons. In a country like Belgium, and particularly in Brussels with its multilingualism, they're not bringing the knowledge of one language to the classroom, they're probably bringing knowledge of 2 or 3. So if we talk, I don't know, typical high school in Ixelles, somewhere like that, an average kid who comes, shall we say, from a Moroccan background, this girl will probably have language knowledge of 3 different languages already. Her French will probably be the dominant language, Moroccan Arabic will probably be the second language which she uses at home, and she'll also know a certain amount of classical Arabic. They're bringing in a lot of linguistic knowledge. All language knowledge is scaffolded on something else. So to ban the student's own language is pointless and impossible anyway. The question is how, much more. So the first clear point is that the L1 must be a point of reference, it cannot be otherwise. The second big reason is a historical reason, and it's about the ownership of the discourse of English language teaching. It has been dominated, as I suggested, by Brits and to a certain extent Americans and Australians in various parts of the world. And these people come from a background of teaching in multilingual classes, small classes, typically not more than 15, where they can't speak all of the students' languages. And they control this world of VLT. They write all of the course books, they write all of the journals, they write all of the applied linguistics books, they write the practice of English language teaching or learning teaching, the teacher training manuals that are used everywhere. And what they write is informed by their own experience. And their own experience does not include what I call real teaching. And what I mean by real teaching is teaching 25 in a class, normal teaching, whether it's primary, secondary or university. I mean, in some university contexts, Russia where I work sometimes, I might have 200 in a class. That's rather more challenging than a group of paying, motivated adults in a private language school, which is what has informed the discourse of ELT. However, this is now shifting. The course books are increasingly not being written by people like me, unfortunately, because I'm losing work. They are much more often being written by people with an intimate knowledge of the local context. The teachers' associations are increasingly being run not by the few expatriates in the country, but by local teachers. And we've even seen now in the international associations like IATEFL, people like Herbert Buchter becoming president of IATEFL. He's not even British, for God's sake, what it really is something quite new. With this shift, and with people like Herbert coming into the picture, it's quite natural that he should be interested in what his background is, which is precisely the kind of state school, state-sponsored teaching of primary, secondary and tertiary, which involves primarily students of one language background in largish classes. And this is the shift that's taking place. The little privileged world of the private language school, sort of the headway kind of person, is beginning to disappear. So there is a shift, a clear shift taking place. There is also a recognition, I think, that learning a language is not just learning a language for transactional reasons. We're all, although it seems not in the high schools in Brussels, but the rest of us are smashed around the head on a regular basis with the Council of Europe Common European Framework of Reference descriptors, A1, A2, B1, B2, all of this stuff. Most of us tend to forget, though, that the point of this document, the Common European Framework of Reference, is not about putting students into levels. It's about promoting inter-European harmony through intercultural understanding. And in many cases, the point of language teaching is partly so that people can learn to speak the language, but it's also partly to promote intercultural competence. Here in Brussels, for example, in the French schools that I know, you can, for example, in the fourth year, you can start studying another foreign language, not English, because you've already started that, maybe Spanish or German. But in the first year, there is no language tuition at all. It is only intercultural training. So if intercultural competence is one of our objectives, we need to think, well, how could we develop intercultural competence? Since the relationship between culture and language is a dialectical one, you cannot really separate one from the other. How could you explore the differences in culture without looking at the language? It's just not possible. If you wanted to understand the culture of a city like Brussels, you'd have to pay some attention to the use of language here. Why is it that the city is covered with advertisements in English? It's a very, very revealing thing in this city. We need to approach culture, at least in part, through language, and that means we're going to be translating, inevitably. So there's this side of it. There's a couple of other points, and I'll bring this to a close. There is, I think, a general agreement these days that in the process of teaching and learning, we want our students to express some degree of personal meaning. We personalize stuff. And in the coursebook series Inside Out, me and my co-authors had personalization activities to every single grammar and vocabulary point we included. We want our students to say what they mean. We want them to express their identity. Well, how do they perceive their identity? Here, particularly, identity is perceived, perhaps first and foremost, in terms of language. If you see yourself, let's say, as a Romanian speaker in a French-speaking environment, the Romanian part of your personality is very, very central. But the same is true more broadly in the complex linguistic world that is Belgium and particularly Brussels. If identity is bound up with linguistic identity, we're doing something very, very strange in banning a student's own language from a classroom. We're banning a fundamental part of how they perceive their identity. That seems to me wrong and counterproductive. A further point to make there, I think, which is related, is that if at the low levels, and most language teaching is A1, A2, B1, and a little bit of B2, at the low levels we want our students to express personal meanings. They can't do it because they don't have the linguistic skills. But they can do it if they're allowed to express their meanings, and then we work at ways of helping them to express it through English. That's a way of discovering the language and also providing them with language help for what they really want to express. Yeah. So quite strong reasons there too. There are also quite strong technological reasons. All of our students in any context know about the internet these days. They probably know a lot more about it than we do, and they will all know Google Translate. And they'll be using Google Translate. At every level of education, I've seen people using Google Translate. Those who have French as a first language are quite advantaged because Google Translate works quite well French-English. It works much less well Dutch-English, and it works really lousy when it comes to something like Russian English or Arabic English or Turkish English. They'll know about this resource though, and they'll be using it badly. If our role as teachers is not just as language instructors, but we have a broader moral responsibility towards our students, whether they're children or adults, surely part of our role must be to develop some kind of digital literacy in our students. That's as important as learning how to write by handwriting these days. You want me to move over a bit? Fine. We're streaming there. And if this is the case, we need to help them with their digital literacies, and that would mean a critical approach to things like Google Translate. If you don't know it, you've got a problem. There's also, if you're teaching university students, a further point. You need to know about these technologies, the translation technologies, because your students will be using them to cheat. Any university teacher is going to have experienced, and high school teacher will have experienced a situation where you get a piece of work which is submitted, which has clearly been downloaded from wherever, or they've intercut bits of Wikipedia into their text, and you can recognize this very, very quickly, because suddenly there's some perfect English in between all the nonsense that they've been writing. The cleverer students are wising up to the fact that they're going to get caught by doing this, that we can spot Wikipedia, and we can certainly spot completely downloaded essays. What people are increasingly doing now is downloading an essay in another language for university, and then using online technology to translate it into whatever language they've got to submit it. So if, for example, you're doing, let's say, a course in media and communications at one of the Brussels universities, you're doing this course in French, you've got to write an essay on semiology, say, well, download the essay in English, stick it into Google Translate, put it into French, tidy up a few mistakes, submit it, and it's very hard to catch these people. So we need to know about that technology too. We've got to have this. There is actually software now which enables us to identify translated plagiarism, but at the moment it's quite expensive to buy. So we need to know more about it. We need to help our students with this stuff. There are also the practicalities. Using the student's own language from time to time is going to be more economical. As a teacher trainer on Celta and Delta courses where we encourage our teachers to elicit all of the time, I've seen so many teachers just wasting hours and hours and hours. I was doing a course, a Celta course in Barcelona last summer. Quite a good teacher, young teacher, was eliciting items of food. And he had some pictures and he had some real objects to elicit these words of food. And he wanted to elicit the word ham, but he didn't bring any ham into the classroom. He'd forgotten it was already eaten, I don't know. And he said to the students, he said, okay, now in a sandwich, what can you put into a sandwich that's meat? And the students said, meat, yes, meat. And so he said, well, meat is from an animal. Ah, see, they could understand. So it's made of meat, it's pink, it's very thin like this. And the students started calling out jamón, or lomo, or various other words in Spanish and Catalan for something which is like ham. And then there was this real issue, what's the difference in English between jamón and jamón ibérico and jamón de Paris or whatever it might be, and what's lomo? It just said to them, okay, look, ham is jamón. Both cooked ham and uncooked ham, it would have saved him 10 minutes. It's just more practical, and we know that. Particularly if you ever have disciplinary issues in your classroom, using the students' is going to be a necessary part of your work. If you are disciplining students, you really don't want to do it in English, which is a language you want them to feel positive about. Yeah? And there's nothing worse than a teacher being sarcastic in high-level English to a student who hasn't really got a clue what they're saying apart from sarcasm. And I see it all of the time. The conclusion of all of this is that the amount of research that's now been done which supports some use of the student's own language in language classrooms is overwhelming. Not only that, but more powerful still as an argument, is that there is not one single piece of research which suggests that English only is the best way to go about it. Not one piece of research. And that's very interesting for a position which has become so dominant. How have we come to believe something which has never been backed up by research? There are, in particular areas of language learning, some very powerful research which has been done into how using the student's own language can be very powerful. Learning vocabulary, for example, and particularly using vocabulary using bilingual word cards, whether they're on pieces of paper or whether they're on an app where you just flick on your telephone. This can increase vocabulary initial acquisition of vocabulary by something like 5 times traditional approaches. It's that powerful. So if you're working in an institution such as I used to here, I used to work for an in-lingua school which has gone belly up, but I worked for an in-lingua school here, and if I'd used French, because I can't speak Dutch well enough, if I'd used French I would have been fired. If you're working for an institution which bans the student's own language, it's the responsibility of the institution now to justify their position, not yours if you're using the student's own language. and you can throw the literature at them. Bibliography is this long these days. Okay, practicalities then. I'll do as many suggestions, practical suggestions, as I can. When I run out of time, then I'll just stop, and you can go to the digital handout and get more if you wish. But it seemed quite fun as a first example of the sorts of things we can do in class to use what is the oldest teaching method for languages that we know of. This is a woodcut from the 16th century, of a book called, I think it's from The Schoolmaster by Roger Ascham. Ascham was the private tutor to Princess Mary before she became Bloody Mary. Ascham was influenced by the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives, and they both promoted a technique called reverse translation or back translation. Guy Cook suggests that if you only know one teaching technique, reverse translation is the one that you should know. The reason why I like it so much, well, there are two reasons. The first reason is that it's linguistically very rich. It provides many opportunities for learning. But the second reason I like it is that it requires zero preparation. And the older I get, the less time I want to spend of my life, cutting things up and putting them in, all that kind of stuff. This is a technique which requires zero preparation, but you need to know what it is you're going to work with. Reverse translation essentially means taking a text, short text, not a 350-word text, a short text, probably a few lines, in one language, translating it into another language, and then translating it back again. Which way round should you go? Well, my strong advice would be to start with an English text, which they translate into their own language, French or Dutch, whatever it is, and then they're translating that back into English. Ways in which this can work. Well, a simple way this can work is at the beginning of a class as a warmer. You may, for example, have some kind of topic that is the topic of the day of the lesson. Well, prepare a little short sentence on that topic and whisper it into someone's ear. Yeah. This person translates it mentally and then whispers in the translated language. So I whispered in English, so you're going to, presumably, Dutch speaking?
Yes.
You're going to whisper it in Dutch. You're going to hear it in Dutch, you translate it back into English, etc. So it's a broken telephone technique. It's fun, it's lively. Of course, like all broken telephones, it breaks down fairly quickly. But what is then interesting about this is that when we've done the activity for a minute or two, with a large class we can have multiple starting points. When it does break down, then we put the students into groups and we reconstruct what happened along the way. And where it breaks down is precisely where they've got language problems. So what you'll find, for example, is that things like compound tenses disappear and become simple tenses. They'll avoid the present perfect and use simple past. They'll avoid the present continuous and use present simple, etc., etc. So it's precisely identifying where things changed and why they changed that is homing in on what is useful for them. So a simple one, yeah, like that. A variation of it is using bits of paper. So, well, I'll finish for that. So take a piece of blank A4. Again, you can write the text at the beginning, or this could be a student-generated text. A couple of lines, no more. A couple of lines at the top. Give it to one student who translates it into their own language. They then fold the paper over so they can only see the Dutch version. That has to be translated back in English, etc., 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 like this. Yeah, so it's the same kind of thing. This is rich in the same way. Putting things a little bit further, using the same reverse translation technique, I've become interested in using translation more and more as a supplement to the materials I write in the course books. At any point in language learning, I assume there's going to be some death by gap fill, where you've done some grammar and you've got to fill in the gaps or do some transformation. And normally when we do that, that's the end of the exercise and we move on to something else. But if you want to exploit this a little bit further, once the students have done that work, tell them to close their books. Take these 8 sentences, typically 8 or 7 sentences in an exercise, a Murphy kind of exercise, and dictate them back to the students. Their job is not to write them in English. Their job is to translate them immediately into their own language, whatever it is in the class, doesn't matter. So they're going to write down 8 sentences in their own language. When we get to the end of the exercise, tell them, right, now with a partner, irrespective of what the other language of their partner is, now translate these back into English. So this is focusing their attention very, very, very directly on the target language which the exercise practices. You with me? What I like about this is that when it comes to getting our students to notice language, we struggle most of the time. They typically, of all ages, only want to know what the correct answer is. We can spend hours doing homework and correcting and making suggestions. We give it back to them, and the buggers never look at it. You know, they just want to know the score. That's all it is. But with this particular approach, what I found is that when we get to this stage of the exercise where they've translated it back into English, probably before the end of the activity, some of them have cheated and have opened their books again. Now, if we can get to a stage in any kind of teaching situation where a student actually wants to look at a grammar exercise, and gap fill at that, then we've done something quite powerful, I think. Yeah? So again, very easy way of manipulating these kinds of grammar or lexical activities in that way, using reverse translation. I also think that we can take this a little bit further, and it works quite well with the coursebook texts that we use. If you're using a coursebook, or even if you're not, a lot of your teaching is going to be driven by text. It might be spoken text or it might be written text. We're often under pressure to move on, to get on to the next unit of study or the next page of the book. We plough through things often too quickly. I've now realised that it's often better to drop a subsequent lesson completely and to exploit more fully what we've already looked at. So let's say we've got a class, let's say it's at a B1 level, and they've looked at a text which is illustrating grammar, vocabulary, whatever it may be. They've looked at a text which is probably at B1 level, it's probably about 220 words long. It's the average text length there. You've done the text, you've done the reading or the listening questions, you've done the vocabulary and the grammar follow-up, you've done the speaking at the end. Well, at the end of the lesson, give the students 3 or 4 minutes and ask them to translate into their own language the first 4 or 5 lines of the text. Make it collaborative, because it's that process of collaboration that opens possibilities for learning. It's not a test, it's learning. 3 or 4, 5 minutes, that's all that's needed at the end. They work and translate this into their own language. Then take in the work. End of lesson. Wait a few lessons. Wait a few lessons. Maybe a week. Then hand their texts back. And their job is to translate it back into English without looking at the course book. And of course they'll want to cheat. But this is really motivating and really driving, and it's going to draw their attention to those features of language in the text which mattered. Same thing. One final suggestion for reverse translation is for anyone who's teaching either examinations or a more written-oriented course. If you're teaching writing, your students will probably at some point have to produce a particular written genre. If they're taking, something like first certificate, they've got to do still the letter of complaint or the report, these kinds of things. Well, there are models of these texts, and the models are provided in the course books and on the exam board websites. So at some point you'll be looking at these models. Look at the models. Do what you would normally do with the models. Get them to notice the useful language, to identify the paragraph structure, underline the key words which they need to learn by heart. They need to learn things like, I look forward to receiving your reply, these kinds of phrases. And again, get them to translate this letter into their own language. Wait a few lessons, give them the letter back without looking at the model, they translate it back into English, and then they compare their version with the model version. What is an added benefit, I think, of this approach is that it helps memorization. Memorization works better when we're very engaged in what we're doing. Learning lists of words, we can do it, but then we forget them immediately because we're not involved in those lists of words. But this process seems to help them to memorize the stuff because they're noticing it much more closely, looking at the differences between I look forward to receiving your reply, or whatever it may be, and the own language equivalent. So we're focusing very clearly on the target language, and it seems to aid memorization. It might seem strange, but those things that students do, like my daughter at university, she spends hours copying things out by hand. It is partly a waste of time, but not entirely. It does help memorization. So that mechanical process helps. So that's reverse translation, or back translation it's sometimes called. It's a rich, rich vein. There's an awful lot that you can do with it, and marvellous because it requires zero preparation. Basic one. Okay. Right. Another approach. I want to make general points here through talking about some specific things. I call this approach assisted translation. One of the problems we have in class when we use translation is that the students, first of all, have crap dictionaries, usually, and they spend hours looking up words in these crap dictionaries, which they then forget. That's not a particularly productive way to spend classroom time. It wouldn't be so bad if they were using good dictionaries, and there are, of course, some good dictionaries. There are good, what are called bilingualized dictionaries now, the big fat ones, which contain all of the features of a good monolingual dictionary, plus explanations in the student's own language. This is the future, and some of these are online. There are good dictionaries, but our students don't use them, and they're not given any training. So I don't want my students spending hours looking up words. What I want them to do when they're translating is I want them to think about how language is put together. And I can demonstrate it with this. I've taken 3 quite well-known quotations in Latin. Now, a lot of the words here are familiar to you. Or you could at least guess what they mean. You may even know the quotations. If you do, that would rather destroy the point of the exercise, but we'll pass on. If your mother tongue is a Romance language, French for example, then you're likely to recognize immediately words like mater. Yeah? So you can begin to translate even if you don't know any Latin. If I were to ask you to translate this, your initial focus would be on figuring out what the words mean, and not what I'm interested in, which is the grammar of Latin. That's what I want you to do. But there is a very simple way of changing this so that you don't focus on the words, but focus on the grammar, and that's by making sure that you know what all the words mean. And here, quite simply, I can do a little glossary. Disco, which I suspect you didn't know, many of you, means learn. Yeah? And dosseo means teach. Now, with that little bit of help and the linguistic knowledge that you have from whichever mother tongue you speak, you can, I think, now begin to work out what all of this means and look at the grammar. I'll give you 2 minutes with a partner. Translate these into English. Yeah? Is the substantial numbers of people forward. Because I really don't think that from here to here makes a difference. That leaning forward is quite a revealing bit of body language. The other thing which is quite revealing, you're playing language detectives. You're playing the game of observing data and hypothesizing about that data and then experimenting with it to work it out. That is, after all, what we want our students to be doing in whatever model of language teaching, but this is very, very close, I think it's very close to the task-based model of language teaching, observing, hypothesizing, trying it out, and that's what you're doing. What's interesting and what's paradoxical, I think, for many people here, is that I'm making your task in some ways easier by giving you the words in a glossary. But although I'm in some ways making it easier, I'm pushing you to do what I want you to do, and not waste your time looking things up in a dictionary or asking your partner what this means. Now this leads us to a fairly obvious conclusion. When it comes to dealing with text, whether it's reading or listening, we should seriously consider the inclusion of glossaries. If you want your students to develop their reading and listening skills, you should be using material which is slightly lower than their level for extensive reading and extensive listening. Don't give them something higher because they'll just block on the unknown vocabulary. If you're using something which is a little bit too hard for them, say a page or two of Edgar Allan Poe, include a glossary, and a bilingual one is going to make a lot more sense. Now this is very easy to do. If you're using a published international course book, before they start the reading task, simply write up the words which you can predict they'll find problematic. Yeah? Why waste time looking at the dictionaries? By providing this kind of support, they can actually then focus on the reading or the listening that's needed, not block on problematic words. And they can also play the game of language detectives and work meaning out from context. This skill of working meaning out from context is a high-level skill. It's something which is characteristic of successful readers, not low-level readers. Low-level readers just block. I don't even push it now at the very low levels. But if we want them to work meaning out from context, we've got to choose the words very carefully. If we don't want them to do that, give them a glossary. Kind of takes them where they want to go. So this is a general point. Providing glossaries of this kind makes the language work richer. I've done this quite successfully with very young children. By very young, I mean 7, 8, primary kids, where we take pop lyrics or poems, kids' poems. I give them the glossary of everything they need, and then their job is to try to translate it so that it makes grammatical sense in their own language. Yeah? What I do as a follow-up, or have done as a follow-up with classes, this was in Romania where I was working a little while, was once they've done that, they've got some pop songs, they've translated it into Romanian, they then upload these subtitles on a YouTube clip. The software is easily available, you can find it on my blog, and then they upload these clips onto a website, and suddenly they get thousands and thousands of hits because everybody in Romania wants to see the translated version of the latest whatever song it is. And if you're into social media, which I'm not especially, you'll know how rewarding it is to get thousands of hits in a week. That's what you want. Okay, so assisted translation. One more area. This one I call translation fuck-ups, and you'll understand why I call that. This is using material of various kinds. This is a menu that I found online with some lovely things. Okay, now in traditional approaches to using translation, we've always been very focused on what is the correct final translation. In the kind of work that I'm suggesting, promoting, along with people like Guy Cook, the final correct translation isn't terribly important. It doesn't matter. What matters is the process of learning which we go through in order to get towards the final of sorts. So using bad English is, maybe we could call it international English rather than bad English. English is a lingua franca, whatever we want to call it. Using English which is clearly wrong is a very useful starting point, and there's a lot of this kind of material which is easily available. It's fun and motivating to work with, but what of course the student's job is, this is not appropriate for Brussels, this is appropriate in Spain. Yeah, they need to understand the language which generated this in the first place. So they're looking at how these mistakes have been made. You would probably as a teacher need to underline the problems, and then they work to discuss where the problems are. I call it fuck-ups because my favorite example of this is from Hungarian. And there's a lot of it around. So the basic idea is using faulty English, English as an international language, as the basis for some kind of exploration of how this process of translation has gone wrong and what we might learn from it. Well, there's plenty of it out there. Brussels is particularly full of English on the street, in hoardings and all the rest of it. Actually, most of it here is pretty good, but not always. There's some spectacularly funny ones, I find. Some announcements, too, on the metro, quite funny, too, on occasion. Yes, I won't go on. Anyway, but there is an obvious source of translation problems, or two obvious sources. One is working with the student's own work, which is going to have translation problems. And the other is to use Google Translate. Because what Google Translate gets wrong is also typically what the students will get wrong. Where there are particular problems, I'll take Russian as an example, the sorts of problems that students have, for example, dropping articles or dropping copula verbs, is precisely what Google Translate gets wrong. If it's German, which I'm struggling to learn, if it's German, what Google Translate gets wrong is word order, every time. And as a learner of German, and Dutch, more or less to the same extent, it's the word order that's such a problem. Well, let's look at where these problems arise. So I took the abstract of this talk, or a version of the abstract of this talk, and stuck it into Google Translate and put it into Dutch. Now, my Dutch is not good enough to identify where the problems are, but you will be able to do so. So we're working from a text of this kind, and we do the cross-linguistic work. Give them a Google Translate text which will contain errors in their own language which they can recognize, give them the original and the target language, English, and their job is to make the corrections. Yeah? Now, this, of course, is working more on their Dutch than it is on their English, but it is directing attention very closely to the English. We can take it further, and I think we should be taking this further, because I think that Google Translate training should be an essential part of our jobs these days. We can take this text. Does anybody not speak Dutch in this room? Well, not very well, anyway. We can take the Dutch text, stick it back into Google Translate, and translate it into English. Babelize it. So you can get an idea of the sorts of problems that the Dutch text included by translating this back into English. So working with this kind of material is rich. If you're lucky enough to have an online classroom, then you can just bring it up at any time you want. If you're working particularly with interactive whiteboards or any kind of online technology, almost anything that you're going to want to do topically can be accessed through Wikipedia and places like that. Well, let's bring up a little Wikipedia text. Let's look at it. Problems understanding it? Okay. Google Translate it into your own language, and then we can explore what's going on there. Instant, powerful, engaging teaching. Okay. So the examples. I think this goes without saying. I mean, the point is to learn English, not to practice your Dutch or your French or something. Whatever. I'd like to just close by making a few comments about technology. I've talked about Google Translate as I think it's so important. It isn't just Google Translate, of course. The Microsoft Translator, or Bing Translator as it's known, is equally important, I think, although students use it less often. It's a pity, because I think that the Microsoft Bing Translator offers more optionalities than Google Translate. One of the things that I think we should be doing is exploring in class, when it's possible, the different translation options that are available to them. If they've never heard of Google Translate, where have they been? But there are other things that they should know about. So bringing into the classroom these possibilities, and if you don't have the online, we can do it with a printout, actually comparing the pages. Which do you prefer? Which works better for you? Which do you find more user-friendly? Which has got the better interface? I think the same with dictionaries. It's been traditionally the case that monolingual dictionaries have been encouraged. I don't see any reason for this anymore. There's good bilingual stuff, but the students need to know what it is and how to use it. So again, in a classroom, we should be bringing in a variety of dictionaries, online dictionaries, compare them, which is more useful, give them a little translation task, which was more useful for you. With the online material, it seems to be growing and growing and growing and getting better and better and better, particularly those which have a user interactive element where you can, I mean, things like Google Translate works that way too. If the translation that's offered into your own language is something you think is wrong, then you can suggest an improvement, and that's how they build their databases. Well, let's get our students involved in this too. Let's get them using the online resources. There are many others. Unfortunately, the Babelfish does not exist. This was an idea of Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the idea is that there's this little sort of metallic fish which you stick in your ear, And once it's in your ear, you can automatically understand every language in the entire galaxy. And everybody in the entire galaxy can automatically understand you. But the way that Adams tells the story is that this immediately led to the most violent intergalactic war that has ever been known. Since once people could understand each other, they wanted to kill them. He tells the story. Well, we don't have the Babelfish, unfortunately. We've got Google Translate, which is getting better. But there are many, many other kinds of technology which I think we should be using. There is such a lot of video material out there that it makes total sense to use it, and to use this in conjunction with subtitling programs, which are easy for the students to use or play with, and translation programs. Getting people, I mentioned earlier, getting people to, this is Rihanna, isn't it? Getting people to look at the latest clips that they want to look at. We don't have to force a particular choice on them. And then working on subtitling, which is a hard skill, because you've got to get this into that in French. It's not easy, a lot of work is done, but it's powerfully rewarding because of the feedback that you get by posting this. Suddenly the work that you're doing is meaningful and not just being lost in the teacher's bag. A lot more suggestions of this kind, but my voice is going. I want to catch up time because we started a little bit late. So I'll stop there and suggest if you want more ideas, have a look at the bloggy thing, digital bloggy handout thingy. Maybe you'd like to buy the book next year, but I doubt it, because it's going to cost a lot of money. Probably. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got 15 minutes now for a coffee break. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.